avoidant men rarely come right out and admit that they are deeply preoccupied with someone. Instead, what they feel can sometimes come out through confusing behaviors that keep you emotionally engaged while allowing them to preserve a sense of distance. Many women interpret these behaviors as proof that a man is uninterested, careless, or intentionally trying to hurt them. But the situation can be much more complicated than that. In some cases, the very effort someone puts into controlling closeness can reveal how emotionally affected they are. The more conflicted they feel, the more complicated their behavior may become. Rather than openly saying, "I care about you and that scares me," they may create distance, test reactions, or carefully manage contact. None of this makes manipulation acceptable, but it can reveal that the connection is affecting them far more deeply than they are willing to acknowledge. Consider how much attention it takes to constantly manage a relationship dynamic. Someone who genuinely feels nothing usually does not spend significant energy trying to influence another person's emotions. They simply move on, become consistently distant, or communicate clearly that they are no longer interested. But a person who repeatedly pulls someone closer, creates distance, watches their reactions, and then changes their behavior is still mentally engaged with the relationship. They may be studying what happens when they disappear, noticing whether you reach out, and paying attention to how quickly you respond when they return. That doesn't automatically mean love or healthy attachment, but it does suggest emotional involvement. The important distinction is that being emotionally invested and being capable of healthy intimacy are not the same thing. Someone can care deeply while still behaving in confusing or damaging ways. Think about the contradiction at the heart of avoidant behavior. They may want connection while simultaneously becoming uncomfortable when that connection starts feeling too real. So instead of moving naturally toward intimacy, they create a strange push and pull cycle. They may distance themselves, then return. They may become warm, then suddenly guarded. They may initiate contact and later act as though nothing happened. From the outside, this can look completely irrational. Internally, however, it can reflect a conflict between desire for closeness and fear of vulnerability. Every withdrawal can create more questions, and every return can restart the emotional connection. That is why the pattern itself deserves attention. Rather than automatically assuming that every confusing behavior proves obsession, look at the consistency, context, and impact. Most importantly, don't confuse emotional intensity with emotional safety. In this video, we're going to look at 6 specific behaviors that can reveal when an avoidant man is unusually preoccupied with you, while also explaining what may actually be happening underneath those behaviors. Once you understand the pattern, you can stop interpreting every withdrawal as proof that you are unwanted and stop chasing every small return of affection as proof that everything has changed. More importantly, you'll be able to recognize when someone's behavior is creating an unhealthy emotional cycle. Understanding these patterns isn't about learning how to manipulate him back or trying to make him more attached. It's about gaining clarity. When you can see the difference between genuine emotional investment and behavior designed to keep you uncertain, you become much less vulnerable to the confusion. You can observe what is happening without allowing his inconsistency to determine your self-worth or emotional stability. The first behavior is selective silence. One of the most confusing things an avoidant man can do is suddenly become quiet after a period of strong connection. He may stop initiating conversations, take much longer to respond, or become noticeably unavailable without giving you a clear explanation. Naturally, your mind starts filling in the blanks. You may wonder whether you said something wrong, whether his feelings disappeared, or whether he has simply lost interest. But when withdrawal repeatedly happens immediately after closeness, it can be part of an established emotional pattern. Sometimes the distance gives him space to regulate himself after intimacy. Other times, he may also be watching what you do when he steps back. Does the silence make you reach out? Do you become more persistent? Do you try harder to restore the connection? Your reaction can tell him how emotionally invested you are. The important thing is to pay attention to the pattern rather than one isolated period of silence. Someone can become busy, overwhelmed, distracted, or simply need personal space without playing any psychological game. But if a person repeatedly disappears after moments of closeness and then returns when the emotional tension has increased, that pattern can become significant. The silence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty naturally makes people think more about the person who withdrew. That can unintentionally strengthen the attachment on both sides. For an avoidant man, the distance may temporarily make closeness feel safer because he has regained a sense of control. At the same time, he may remain mentally focused on whether you will pursue him. So the silence isn't necessarily proof that he doesn't care, but it also shouldn't automatically be romanticized as proof that he's secretly obsessed. What matters most is whether he eventually communicates honestly and consistently. The second behavior is using jealousy as a way to measure your interest. Some avoidant men may casually mention attention from other women, bring up an ex, talk about someone flirting with them, or make comments that subtly remind you they have other options. Sometimes this is deliberate, and sometimes it happens because they want reassurance without having to ask for it directly. Instead of saying, "Do you actually care about me?" they create a situation where they can watch your reaction. Do you become quieter? Do you ask questions? Do you seem bothered? Do you suddenly become more attentive? Your reaction becomes information they can use to estimate how strongly you feel about them. This can be especially revealing when the person seems far more interested in your response than in the supposed romantic alternative they're talking about. But jealousy should never be mistaken for proof of love. Someone can use jealousy because they are insecure, controlling, seeking validation, or simply immature. If a person repeatedly tries to make you compete for their attention, the healthiest response isn't to compete harder. Step back and observe what is happening. An emotionally secure person doesn't need to manufacture rivalry to establish their value. When someone keeps introducing other people into the dynamic, they may be trying to protect themselves from vulnerability by forcing you to reveal your feelings first. In their mind, they can avoid the risk of confession because your reaction gives them the information they wanted, but this still creates an unhealthy dynamic if it becomes a regular strategy. You deserve communication that doesn't require you to decode jealousy tests just to understand where you stand. So how do you protect yourself when you recognize these patterns? This is where things become much more important than simply figuring out whether an avoidant man is secretly obsessed with you. Understanding his behavior has little value if you use that understanding to excuse everything he does. A person can be deeply affected by you and still lie, manipulate, withdraw, or behave in ways that damage your emotional well-being. His internal feelings do not automatically make his actions acceptable. That's why you have to look beyond the obvious behaviors and pay attention to the explanations he gives for them. Does he consistently tell you one thing while behaving differently? Does he blame circumstances every time he disappears? Does he deny feelings that his actions repeatedly contradict? The truth becomes easier to see when you stop focusing only on what he might feel and start examining what he consistently does. Many people become trapped because they spend so much time trying to interpret the hidden meaning behind confusing behavior that they overlook the actual pattern. He may explain his distance one way today and completely differently tomorrow. He may tell you he doesn't want anything serious while continuing to seek emotional closeness. He may claim that he doesn't care while repeatedly returning whenever you begin to detach. These contradictions can keep you emotionally occupied because you're constantly trying to solve the puzzle, and that is exactly why clarity matters. If someone repeatedly gives you mixed signals, you don't have to become a detective to earn the truth. You can simply recognize the inconsistency and decide what it means for you. Understanding psychological patterns should help you protect your peace, not encourage you to tolerate behavior that repeatedly leaves you anxious, confused, or questioning your value. This is also why learning to recognize deception matters. Sometimes the behavior itself is only the visible part of a much larger pattern. A person may hide their intentions, minimize their feelings, create excuses for their withdrawal, or present a carefully edited explanation that keeps you from understanding what is really happening. When you only recognize the push and pull behavior, you can still become vulnerable to the stories surrounding it. You may convince yourself that every lie is actually fear, every disappearance is secretly love, and every confusing action is evidence of hidden attachment. That's dangerous because it can make you ignore what the relationship is actually doing to you. The goal isn't to expose someone so you can win the psychological game. The goal is to become clear enough that deception no longer controls your decisions, your confidence, or your emotional stability. The third behavior is emotional breadcrumbing. This happens when an avoidant man gives you small bursts of emotional closeness without creating the consistency needed for a secure relationship. Maybe he sends a message late at night saying he misses you. Perhaps he suddenly opens up about something deeply personal, becomes affectionate during a private moment, or unexpectedly tells you how much you mean to him. For a moment, the emotional wall seems to disappear. You finally see the vulnerable person you've been waiting to see. Then, almost as quickly as he opened up, he retreats again. The warmth disappears, communication becomes distant, and you're left wondering what happened. Those moments can feel incredibly powerful because they seem to confirm that there is something real underneath the emotional distance. But one intense moment doesn't automatically create a healthy relationship. Consistency is what gives emotional intimacy meaning. These small emotional openings can happen because the person genuinely misses you and struggles to contain those feelings. He may become overwhelmed by the connection, reach out during a vulnerable moment, and then feel exposed afterward. Once the intensity passes, his instinct may be to restore emotional distance. This creates a cycle where you receive just enough affection to remain hopeful, followed by enough withdrawal to make you question everything. The result can be extremely addictive because you're no longer responding only to the person, you're waiting for the next emotional high. Every affectionate message feels like a reward, and every disappearance creates anticipation for his return. That cycle can keep you invested even when the overall relationship isn't giving you stability. So when those emotional breadcrumbs appear, don't judge the connection solely by its most beautiful moments. Look at the entire pattern and ask whether his actions provide the consistency, honesty, and emotional safety you actually need. These emotional breadcrumbs keep you emotionally invested because they give you a glimpse of the connection you want without giving you the relationship consistency you actually need. An avoidant man may get temporary relief from expressing what he feels while still avoiding the full exposure that comes with genuine vulnerability. He gets to choose the moment, the intensity, and the amount of emotion he reveals. Pay attention to when these moments happen. Sometimes he suddenly becomes affectionate when you begin stepping back, stop initiating, or seem less emotionally available. That timing can suggest that he is highly aware of changes in your behavior. The problem is that these moments can create a powerful cycle of hope. You receive just enough warmth to believe deeper intimacy is coming, but then the emotional distance returns. Eventually, you can find yourself waiting for the next small sign instead of asking whether the overall relationship is meeting your needs. The fourth behavior is boundary testing. Healthy relationships require both people to recognize and respect each other's limits, but someone who struggles with intimacy may repeatedly push against those limits to discover what will happen. He might cancel plans at the last moment, disappear after a deeply intimate encounter, arrive late without much concern, or ignore requests for clearer communication. One incident doesn't necessarily mean anything, but when the same behavior happens again and again after you've clearly expressed what you need, it becomes a pattern worth noticing. Every time you communicate a boundary and he tests it again, the situation is revealing something about the relationship. He's learning whether you will hold your position or eventually give in. And you are learning something too, whether this person is capable of respecting your needs when those needs conflict with his desire for comfort, distance, or control. Boundary testing can become especially confusing because the person may not openly say that they are testing you. Instead, the behavior happens indirectly. He may push a little further, wait for your reaction, and then decide whether he can repeat it. Over time, this can create a relationship where he has tremendous freedom while you carry most of the emotional consequences. He gets to disappear when closeness feels uncomfortable, return when he misses you, and expect access to you without necessarily offering the consistency you have requested. Sometimes this behavior may also come from abandonment fears. A person who is deeply afraid of being left may unconsciously test how much someone will tolerate before finally walking away. But understanding the fear behind the behavior doesn't mean you should accept the behavior itself. Compassion and boundaries can exist together. You can understand why someone behaves badly without volunteering to remain the person who absorbs the consequences. There is another important part of boundary testing that many people overlook. Your response teaches the relationship what is acceptable. If you clearly state a boundary but immediately abandon it whenever he withdraws, returns, or becomes affectionate again, the message becomes confusing. He learns that your limits may disappear when emotional pressure increases. On the other hand, when you calmly maintain your standards without threats, punishment, or dramatic reactions, you create clarity. You are showing that connection with you does not require you to surrender your self-respect. The strongest response is not necessarily the one that creates the biggest emotional reaction. Sometimes it is the quietest one. You simply follow through on what you said you would do. If someone repeatedly refuses to respect a reasonable boundary, you don't need to invent another psychological game to defeat theirs. You can allow their behavior to reveal whether they are actually capable of having a healthy relationship with you. If you have ever experienced this pattern, pay close attention to the moments when the testing becomes most obvious. The way you respond during those moments can either reinforce the cycle or interrupt it. Many people react emotionally because they are desperate to restore the connection, and that desperation can accidentally teach the other person that withdrawing, cancelling, or becoming unavailable will bring them more attention. A calmer response changes the dynamic because you stop rewarding inconsistency with increased pursuit. That doesn't mean playing hard to get or intentionally withholding affection. It means becoming consistent with your own standards. If someone repeatedly crosses a boundary, your response should come from self-respect, rather than a desire to make them afraid of losing you. The goal isn't to gain power over them. The goal is to stop giving someone else the power to determine how much disrespect you will tolerate simply because you care about them. The fifth behavior is mirroring your detachment. When an avoidant man becomes highly focused on someone, he may pay very close attention to changes in their emotional availability. If you begin responding less frequently, taking longer to answer, or showing less enthusiasm, he may suddenly become even more distant. Sometimes it can seem as though he is trying to prove that he can care less than you do. You step back slightly, and he steps back dramatically. You become less available for a day, and suddenly he becomes unavailable for several days. You stop chasing, and he seems to turn his emotional distance into a competition. This can be a sign that he is closely monitoring the dynamic. But again, it is important not to automatically label this as proof of obsession. Mirroring can also come from defensiveness, insecurity, pride, or a desire to protect oneself from rejection. What makes this pattern psychologically interesting is the speed and precision of the response. A person who is genuinely unaffected may simply continue living their life without carefully adjusting their behavior according to yours. But someone who immediately reacts to every shift can reveal that your emotional availability matters greatly to them. They may be thinking, if she's pulling away, I need to protect myself before she can hurt me. Instead of admitting that your distance affects them, they respond by creating even more distance. This can turn into an emotional competition where both people are waiting to see who will break first. Neither person wants to appear more invested, so each withdrawal produces another withdrawal. Eventually, the relationship becomes less about connection and more about who can tolerate the most silence. That isn't intimacy. It's two people protecting themselves while remaining emotionally focused on each other. There can also be an ego-protective element behind this behavior. If an avoidant man is uncomfortable with how strongly he feels, convincing himself that he cares less can temporarily make those feelings easier to manage. By matching or exceeding your detachment, he can tell himself that he is still in control. He doesn't have to acknowledge how much your absence bothers him because his behavior allows him to maintain an image of emotional independence. But this is where you need to be careful. Someone mirroring your withdrawal does not necessarily mean they are secretly desperate for you. Sometimes it simply means they are responding defensively, The healthiest approach is not to increase your own detachment to trigger a stronger reaction. Instead, be honest about your level of interest and observe whether the other person can meet you with direct communication. You shouldn't have to create emotional scarcity just to discover whether someone values you. The sixth and perhaps more subtle behavior is creating emotional cliffhangers. This happens when someone leaves conversations unfinished, makes mysterious comments, hints at something without explaining it, or suddenly ends an interaction at the moment when emotional tension is highest. You are left wondering what they meant, what they were about to say, or what might happen next. That uncertainty can keep someone occupying your thoughts long after the conversation has ended. Humans naturally want unfinished situations to reach some kind of resolution, which is why unclear communication can become so mentally consuming. An avoidant person may use this dynamic intentionally, or it may happen because they become uncomfortable once a conversation reaches emotional depth. Either way, the result can be the same. You spend more time analyzing the interaction than actually experiencing a secure connection. Imagine having a meaningful conversation and suddenly hearing, "There's something I need to tell you, but maybe another time." Then the subject disappears. Or perhaps he says something emotionally significant and refuses to explain what he meant. Maybe he ends a conversation abruptly just when you feel like you're finally getting somewhere. These unfinished moments can create a strong desire for answers. You replay the conversation, analyze his words, and wonder whether there was a hidden message behind them. If this happens repeatedly, the uncertainty itself can become part of the relationship. You are no longer responding to what he clearly communicates. You are responding to what you think he might mean. And that is a dangerous place to remain for too long because imagined possibilities can become more emotionally powerful than reality. Healthy intimacy doesn't require you to constantly decode someone's unfinished sentences. The reason emotional cliffhangers can be so powerful is that they keep attention focused on the person even when they aren't physically present. An unresolved conversation can follow you throughout the day. You may replay his tone, remember a particular expression, or wonder whether his last message contained some hidden meaning. If someone deliberately creates this uncertainty, it can become a way of maintaining psychological presence without offering genuine emotional availability. But even when it isn't deliberate, the effect can still be exhausting. You deserve relationships where important things can eventually be discussed openly, rather than relationships built around constant guessing. Mystery may create excitement in the beginning, but long-term emotional security comes from clarity. If someone continually keeps you uncertain about their intentions, don't measure the depth of the relationship by how intensely you think about them. Measure it by how consistently they show up and communicate. Now step back and look at all 6 behaviors together. Selective silence, jealousy-provoking comments, emotional breadcrumbs, boundary testing, mirroring your distance, and creating unresolved emotional tension can all become part of a powerful push and pull cycle. When these patterns appear together, it can certainly indicate that the person is paying significant attention to the relationship and is emotionally affected by what happens between you. But there is an important distinction you should never lose sight of. Emotional preoccupation is not the same as healthy love. Someone can think about you constantly and still be unable to provide security, honesty, respect, or consistency. They can miss you and still hurt you. They can fear losing you and still push you away. They can have strong feelings and still make choices that leave you emotionally exhausted. Understanding that distinction protects you from romanticizing behavior that may actually be damaging. And once you recognize the pattern, a natural question appears. What happens when you stop responding the way the cycle expects you to respond? What happens when silence no longer sends you chasing? What happens when an emotional breadcrumb doesn't immediately pull you back in? What happens when someone mentions another woman and you refuse to compete? These moments can change the dynamic because many push and pull patterns depend on predictable reactions. If withdrawal normally causes you to pursue, then your pursuit becomes part of the cycle. If jealousy normally makes you seek reassurance, that reaction becomes part of the cycle too. When you stop automatically responding from anxiety and instead respond from self-respect, the pattern can no longer operate in exactly the same way. That doesn't guarantee that the other person will suddenly change, but it gives you something far more valuable: clarity about what they do when their usual strategies stop producing the response they expected. This is where silence can become completely different from the silence used as a psychological tactic. You aren't staying quiet to punish him, make him jealous, or force him to chase you. You're simply refusing to participate in a dynamic that keeps leaving you confused. You don't have to chase breadcrumbs. You don't have to compete with imaginary rivals. You don't have to prove your feelings every time someone pulls away. You can allow space to exist without rushing in to fill it. When that happens, the other person is left with a choice. They can communicate more honestly and move toward a healthier connection, or they can continue the same cycle and reveal that they were more interested in controlling the dynamic than building something stable. Either outcome gives you useful information. Your silence doesn't need to manipulate someone into loving you. It only needs to give you enough distance to see the relationship clearly. When the usual emotional reactions disappear, the person may also become more aware of their own feelings. The silence they once used to create uncertainty can suddenly become uncomfortable for them. The distance they created to regain control can force them to experience what your absence actually feels like. The attention they expected to receive may no longer arrive, and instead of focusing on whether you are still chasing, they may have to confront the possibility that you are genuinely moving forward. That can create an internal shift, especially if they have spent a long time avoiding vulnerability. But you should never stay silent solely to produce that reaction. If they come back, what matters isn't how intensely they return. What matters is whether they return differently. Are they willing to communicate? Do they respect your boundaries? Are they consistent? Can they offer something more stable than another temporary emotional high? That is the real awakening worth paying attention to. Not the moment an avoidant man suddenly realizes he misses you, but the moment he understands that his old patterns have consequences. When you stop participating in the cycle, he may finally see the distance between what he feels and how he behaves. He may realize that pushing someone away doesn't guarantee they'll remain available forever. He may understand that emotional control is not the same thing as emotional security. And he may finally recognize that the person he kept trying to keep close from a safe distance can choose to walk away. But whether that realization changes him is his responsibility, not yours. Your responsibility is to protect your emotional health, maintain your standards, and judge the relationship by behavior rather than potential. If you want to understand what can happen psychologically when an avoidant person realizes that their usual push and pull tactics no longer work, watch the next video on screen. It explores what they may begin confronting when you finally stop playing the role they expected you to play.